Picture a quiet, sunny day in a park, where an elderly black woman is relaxing on a bench, enjoying the fresh air, but suddenly everything changes. A police officer with a cold gaze approaches her, and tension instantly hangs in the air. Without reason, without warning, he strikes her. Shock, anger, fear, all of it blends into one terrible picture of injustice. But when her son arrives on the scene, you should have seen their faces. This is the moment when justice catches up with those who are used to hiding behind their power. Stop right now and write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. You have no idea how important you are to us. Every comment, every opinion helps promote our channel, makes us stronger and helps fight injustice. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you for being with us. You are our inspiration. Enjoy watching. On a warm, sunny day, it seemed as if the whole world around was frozen in peace. An elderly black woman, Mrs. Jenkins, sat on a park bench. Her gray hair gently fluttered in the wind, and there was a slight smile on her face. She was simply enjoying the moment, watching the children playing nearby. Life, it seemed, was finally giving her the peace she longed for. But this calm did not last long. A man in uniform was approaching her from a distance, a white policeman with a cold, tense expression on his face. He walked quickly, his footsteps echoing loudly on the asphalt path. People around him began to notice his approach, some exchanging glances as if they sensed a storm coming. Mrs. Jenkins looked up as he approached. She hadn't expected anything bad. Why should she be afraid? She'd lived in this town all her life, knew every corner, every neighbor, but something in his eyes made her heart skip a beat. This policeman wasn't here to talk. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, stopping in front of her, his shadow looming over her fragile figure. "Just resting, officer," she answered calmly, although her voice trembled. "You can't just sit around in this park," he said, his eyes flashing. "There have to be rules for people like you. People like you." The words hit her in the face harder than any fist could. She looked at him silently, her hands starting to shake a little. Her mind went back decades, to a time when the words "people like you" meant that she wasn't allowed to be equal, that her place was somewhere on the sidelines of life. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer," she tried to say calmly. But her calm only made him angrier. The policeman took a step forward, leaned over and whispered ominously into her face. "Don't you understand? I told you to get out of here, right now." But Mrs. Jenkins did not budge. She had lived too long, had seen too much pain and injustice, to back down from this man. She sat silently, her eyes meeting his, dignified and humble. His face twisted with anger. He couldn't hold back any longer. And then something terrible happened. With a sudden movement, faster than anyone expected, he grabbed her arm. She cried out in pain, her body instinctively moving back, but his grip was iron. The next moment, his fist crashed down on her face. A loud bang, the sound of impact, echoed through the park. People around froze. Some jumped, not believing their eyes. Time seemed to slow down. Mrs. Jenkins fell to the ground, her hands shaking, her face covered, blood beginning to trickle from her nose. Shock and fear pierced her heart, but she could not even scream, too stunned, too broken by this display of hatred. The crowd began to gather, some taking out their phones, some trying to shout, "What are you doing?" But the policeman ignored them. He was standing over the woman again, ready to continue. His eyes were burning with the hatred he had been building up for years, hatred for those he considered wrong, not like him. But at that moment, another voice came from behind him, a deep, menacing voice, full of rage. "Hey, get your hands off my mother." The policeman froze for a moment, but did not turn around. His fist, frozen in the air, was ready to fall again on the old woman, who could barely lift her head. Her face was disfigured by bruises and blood. She was breathing with difficulty, lying on the cold ground. The voice sounded again, this time louder and with a fury that made even the passers-by feel uneasy, frozen in horror. "I said, get your hands off my mother." The cop turned slowly. A tall black man stood before him, his powerful, stone-cut frame filling the air with menace. It was her son, James Jenkins. His eyes were blazing, his hands were fisted protectively. He came closer with each step, his eyes never leaving the cop's face, and the cop felt a strange chill, as if a wind of change had suddenly swept through the park. The crowd froze, people held their phones at the ready, recording every second. Some whispered in fear, some stood motionless, unable to even move, afraid that the tension in the air would break at any moment. Everyone understood that in these seconds something much greater than just the fate of one person was being decided. The policeman, feeling threatened, took one last look at the woman lying on the ground and thought for a split second, but his pride and inner anger took over again. He couldn't back down. He couldn't let anyone, especially someone like James, get in his way. "Is that your mother?" the policeman sneered, still holding on to the echoes of power and control. "Then you're probably just like her, you like to break the rules, huh?" James didn't answer. His face remained stony, but there was an all-consuming rage in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had been through too much, who had seen injustice, but who was no longer willing to tolerate it. "I'm not going to tell you twice," James said quietly, his voice so controlled it was menacing. "You hit her, and you're going to pay for it." The policeman stepped forward, his hand on his pistol holster, and at that moment fear struck with renewed force in everyone watching this horrific spectacle. The crowd began to whisper quietly. People were afraid that a shot would be fired at any moment. There was hatred in his eyes, not just for James, but for everything he represented. This was more than just a clash with a person. This was a clash with his ideas about a world full of division and oppression. He slowly pulled out his gun and pointed it at James. The crowd gasped and several people screamed. "Come on," the policeman hissed, his hand shaking with tension. "You want to say something? Well, tell me now. Come on, let's see what you do when I shoot you right here." James stood there, his eyes focused on the policeman, but inside he was in a turmoil. He saw before him not just a man, but the embodiment of everything he and his family had to deal with throughout their lives. The air was thick with tension, like before a storm. Mrs. Jenkins, still lying on the ground, struggled to stand, her voice hoarse and painful. "James, no need." But he couldn't stop, not when standing before him was the man who embodied all the hatred and injustice he had tried to protect his family from. The policeman stood with his arm outstretched, his gun pointed straight at James's chest, his fingers slowly tightening on the trigger. The crowd around him froze, everyone afraid to make the slightest move. There was an oppressive anticipation in the air, as if the whole world had frozen. Watching this deadly scene, people stopped breathing, and even the light wind stopped rustling the leaves of the trees. Only silence and fear. Mrs. Jenkins, struggling to her elbows, looked at her son through a haze of pain. Her heart sank, unable to believe that this nightmare was happening. The pain she had seen her entire life flashed before her eyes, the humiliation, the violence, the fear of white police officers who had always been above the law for people like her. But now her son stood before this evil man, standing proudly, despite the threat of death. "You know how this ends, right?" the policeman sneered, his voice full of venom. "One step, and you'll be gone." He stepped forward, the gun still pointed at James. The proximity of the weapon made the air around him tense, but James didn't back down. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, even though deep down he knew the cop was about to pull the trigger. The fear of possible death was real, but what angered and scared him most was that his mother was suffering here, before his eyes. "What do you mean by this?" James said calmly, his voice quiet but firm. He was prepared for what might happen, and there was a determination in his eyes that made the policeman hesitate slightly, but only for a moment. Mrs. Jenkins tried to speak again, but her voice was weak. She saw before her not only her son, but the chain of pain and injustice that had stretched across generations. Her father had suffered at similar hands. Her brother had been arrested and beaten for daring to defend himself, and now her son faced the same hatred that had haunted their family. Fear for his life had turned to despair, tearing her apart from within. "James, please," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word, tears streaming down her cheeks. The policeman noticed her weakness, her fear, and it only fueled his rage. He turned to her, looking contemptuously at her wounded face. "That's the problem," he hissed like a snake. "She didn't teach you where your place is." And with that, he swung his fist and hit the woman again, who was still lying on the ground. His fist met her face again, and the sound of the blow pierced the park like a bolt from the blue. The crowd gasped, and someone screamed in horror. Mrs. Jenkins collapsed back onto the ground, her body curled up like a fragile leaf torn by the wind. Her breathing became ragged and blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. In that moment, all the fear James had felt for his mother turned into something else. It wasn't just rage, it was an all-consuming hatred, driven by helplessness in the face of the injustice that had ravaged their lives for centuries. "That's enough," James hissed, his fists clenched so hard they turned white. "You'll pay for this." The policeman turned back to him, grinning, his eyes sparkled with satisfaction. He liked breaking people, liked feeling his power over them, but at that moment he didn't realize that he had crossed a line that should never be crossed. "Me, to answer for this?" he chuckled, aiming the gun straight at James's heart. "Who's going to stop me? You?" James knew that at any moment it could all end, but he didn't care about his own life. His mother lay beaten at his feet. He had to do something, at any cost. The strength he felt in that moment didn't come from physical might. It was the anger of generations, of those who had been broken in the face of racism, and of those who could no longer take it. The policeman stepped forward, his fingers slowly tightening on the trigger. Everything around him went silent. Every breath seemed loud. Fear and terror completely engulfed the crowd, and James felt the whole world shrinking around him, slowing time as the fate of this moment was decided. The click echoed through the park, but no shot came. The policeman hesitated, confusion flashing in his eyes as he realized the gun had misfired. His finger twitched helplessly on the trigger, and the sudden realization of his vulnerability made him break out in a cold sweat. But he quickly recovered, gritting his teeth. The rage was building inside him, overwhelming his mind. "You're so damn lucky," he hissed, swinging his leg out to kick Mrs. Jenkins, who lay motionless on the ground. Her exhausted body was too weak to defend itself, and she only curled into a ball, preparing for another blow. But that blow never came. With a force he hadn't expected, James lunged at the policeman, his body moving like lightning. In an instant, he grabbed the hand that was swinging and squeezed it so hard that the bones crunched. The policeman cried out in unexpected pain, his face contorted in rage and fear as he realized he had lost control of the situation. "Enough!" James didn't shout, but his voice was filled with such rage that it seemed it could incinerate everything around him. "You won't touch her again." The policeman tried to pull away, but James held him tightly. Panic gripped the man who had just felt all-powerful, capable of destroying another person's life without consequence. Now he found himself in the place of the victim, his life in the hands of someone he considered beneath him. The fear he had inspired in others now gripped him. He tried to reach for the baton on his belt, but James, still clutching his hand, delivered a powerful blow to the policeman's stomach, knocking the breath out of his chest. He doubled over, his gun falling from his hands and hitting the ground with a dull thud. "What does it feel like?" James said, his voice low and pained. "What does it feel like to be helpless?" The policeman couldn't answer. He was too stunned to think, much less speak. He was used to being the one who manipulated fear, the one who dealt the blows, but now he was the victim, standing on the edge of the abyss. The crowd watching seemed petrified. People had their phones out, capturing every moment, every sound. They couldn't take their eyes off the scene. The fear they felt for James and Mrs. Jenkins was mixed with the horror of what was happening right before their eyes. No one knew how it would end. James let go of the policeman, who collapsed to the ground, clutching his side, trying to catch his breath, but instead of retreating, he tried to get up again, his face red with humiliation and anger. He couldn't allow himself, a representative of authority, to be humiliated like this in front of a crowd. You'll regret this," he croaked, barely breathing, but his voice no longer held the same confidence as before. He was no longer in control of the situation, but even that didn't stop him from wanting to continue the violence. He took another step forward, reaching for his baton, but James was faster. In one motion, he knocked the cop off his feet, pinning him to the ground. James pressed his knee into his chest, and the cop wheezed, desperately trying to get air. His eyes were wide with fear. It wasn't just fear of humiliation now, it was fear for his life. "You spent your whole life thinking you could do whatever you wanted with people like my mother," James said through clenched teeth, his face close to the cop's. "Thought you were untouchable?" The policeman wheezed, trying to say something, but he didn't have enough air. James released him with one last push, sending him tumbling back to the ground like a rag doll. The cop lay gasping for air, his face twisted in fear, pain, and helplessness. The crowd around him fell silent, unsure of how to react to what had just happened. But instead of continuing, James stood up and turned to his mother. She was lying on the ground, her face scarred from the blows, but her eyes still shone with dignity. Even after all she had been through, she remained strong. The policeman lay on the ground, wheezing, but his eyes still blazed with hatred. He couldn't believe that this day, which had begun like any other, had become the moment when his power, his authority, was being questioned. His breathing was ragged, but his hand reached for his baton again. He knew this was his only chance to regain control, to regain a sense of power, if only for a moment. Mrs. Jenkins, still lying on the ground, tried to open her eyes, her mind floating between pain and fear. She couldn't get up, couldn't protect herself. She felt like every breath brought a new wave of pain into her battered body. Her hands were shaking, and she tried hard to look into her son's eyes, but her gaze was fixed on the figure of the policeman, who was slowly rising from the ground. This man had no intention of stopping. The policeman finally grabbed his baton and rose abruptly to his feet. His face was twisted with anger and humiliation. There was nothing human left in his eyes, only primal fury. His bloody hand gripped the weapon tightly, and suddenly, like a madman, he lunged at James with wild, uncontrollable force. "You will know your place," he shouted, waving his club. James barely managed to dodge the blow, but the baton slid across his shoulder, causing him to stagger back. Pain shot through his body, but it was nothing compared to the rage that was boiling inside. Understanding flashed through James's eyes, that this man who was ready to spill blood no longer knew boundaries, no longer obeyed laws or morals. His racism had become his only truth. "You still think you can kill her?" James growled, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. "You think you can kill us all?" The crowd around them grew restless. People began to scream, begging for it to stop. Some called the police. Some tried to intervene, but fear paralyzed them. People knew this was more than just a fight. This was a confrontation with something that had been building up for years, decades, and this day could end in bloodshed. The policeman swung his baton again, but James grabbed his hand with an iron grip and twisted it so that the crunch of bones could be heard even in the crowd. The policeman screamed in pain, but did not stop. His face was distorted with rage, and it seemed that he had lost all control of himself. The baton fell from his hands, but he rushed at James, trying to knock him down. And at that moment, James felt fear grip him. This man was mad. He would not stop until he destroyed everything that stood in his way, and this could be his last moment. The seconds dragged on slowly, like a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. "You're not a man," the policeman hissed, his face just inches from James's. "You're nothing." And then he punched James again, this time in the face. James staggered, but stayed on his feet. The crowd gasped, holding their breath as they watched their struggle grow more brutal. But James did not let the cop get the upper hand again. His fist came down hard on the cop, sending him flying backwards, falling to his knees. But even then, the cop didn't stop. He reached for the gun again, which was still lying on the ground, ready to use it despite the misfire. James knew instantly that this man wouldn't miss another chance. The cop tried to reload his gun with trembling hands, his face twisted with hatred. He couldn't allow himself to be humiliated in front of all these witnesses. "Die," he whispered, pointing the gun at James. Mrs. Jenkins, lying on the ground, saw it. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. Only terror took over her. All she could do was pray that somehow her son would be saved from certain death. At this point the silence became deafening. People froze, waiting for something inevitable to happen. The policeman rose to his feet again, his face twisted with hatred. His eyes were filled not only with rage, but also with a ruthless confidence that he could do whatever he wanted. He did not see Mrs. Jenkins as a person, only as an object of his contempt. To him, she was just another problem to be crushed by force. He glared at the crowd, as if their presence only fueled his anger, as if their fear only fed his desire to dominate. He stepped forward and swung his club at Mrs. Jenkins's face. The blow was devastating, and the woman fell back to the ground. Her face was contorted in pain. Blood flowed from her cut lip, and for a moment it seemed as if she had lost consciousness. The crowd held its breath, and someone clapped his hands to his mouth, trying to stifle a scream of horror. "You think you're special?" the policeman growled, leaning over her body, his voice full of contempt. "You think your life means anything?" Her weak moan was barely audible. Mrs. Jenkins tried to sit up, but her body would not obey. Fear paralyzed her, and she had neither the strength nor the ability to defend herself. She was helpless before this man, who saw in her only a hateful symbol of what he had despised all his life. "Get up!" the policeman shouted, grabbing her roughly by the shoulder and yanking her to her feet. He shook her, as if trying to knock the last of her dignity out of her. Her legs gave out and she collapsed to the ground again. "You're nothing!" he shouted and hit her again, this time in the ribs, making her cough, trying to draw air into her lungs. The pain shot through her body like a fiery blow, and every breath was an incredible effort. She felt her ribs crack under the weight of the blow, but even that didn't stop the policeman. In that moment, the racism that had built up over the years, decades of hatred, poured out mercilessly in those blows. It was more than violence, it was a show of power, an attempt to suppress not just a woman, but an entire race. He knew what he was doing, and he loved it. "Look at her!" He looked back at the crowd, his face red with anger and excitement. "This is the end of you. You are all like this. You think you can claim respect? You deserve only one thing: to obey." There was such hatred in his voice that the crowd froze in horror. Some began to retreat, unable to bear to watch this horror, but no one could look away, as if what was unfolding before them was not just an act of cruelty, but something deeper, the embodiment of centuries of fear and oppression. The policeman swung his baton again, but at that moment James, his son, burst into the circle like a whirlwind. His heart was pounding. Fear for his mother's life had taken over him completely. He rushed at the policeman, his fists crashing down on him with such force that the policeman staggered back, off balance. But that didn't stop him. James knew that here, at that moment, not only his mother's fate was being decided, but his own as well. The policeman stood up, his eyes narrowed in cruel contempt. He wiped the blood from his lip and looked at James with a sneer. "There you are," he said coldly, raising his club again. "You think I can't handle you too?" But now the situation became even more threatening. The crowd saw James, in anger and despair, rush at the policeman, trying to protect his mother. But the policeman was ready. He met James with a powerful blow to the chest, so that he flew back, falling to the ground next to his mother. "You thought you were strong?" the policeman hissed, his baton rising again to strike. "But you're just another piece of trash." The blow of the baton was a dull sound. James tried to get up, but each time he was knocked back. The policeman did not stop. It seemed that his cruelty knew no bounds. He wanted to leave a mark not only on the bodies of these people, but also in their hearts, to prove that their place was underfoot. Mrs. Jenkins, watching her son being beaten, gathered her last strength, trying to reach out to him, but her body did not obey. She felt that every second was bringing them closer to the inevitable end. Fear for her son's life burned her from within. But the policeman did not stop. The policeman stood up again, his breathing heavy, but his rage and anger only growing. He saw before him more than just an elderly black woman. He saw a symbol of everything he hated and despised. In his fevered mind, she was a representative of the force that he believed threatened his power, his peace, his rights, and this rage in his head, deeply laced with racism, drove him to greater violence. He stepped toward Mrs. Jenkins, lying on the ground, her body unable to withstand this endless torture. Her face was covered in bruises and bloodshot, her lips were split, her eyes were swollen, but the policeman did not see her as a victim. He saw an enemy, someone who needed to be crushed to the end. He raised his baton, his gaze was dark and cold, and in that moment his face lost all human form. It was only a tool of hatred, created by violence that fed on the fear and powerlessness of those he considered beneath him. "You think you deserve pity?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You think any of you deserve anything more than this?" He brought the club down hard on her stomach, and the air rushed out of Mrs. Jenkins's chest. Her eyes widened in pain, her body convulsed, but she could not make a sound. Every movement caused her incredible agony. Her ribs were broken, and with each blow they broke more and more. She was choking, blood was pouring from her mouth, and her eyes, full of horror and fear, were turned to nothing, to the sky, which seemed to have turned away from her. The policeman struck again, this time across her back. Mrs. Jenkins arched in pain, but she couldn't scream. Her breathing became short, ragged gasps, as if her lungs could no longer fully fill with air. Tears ran down her face, mixing with the blood. She felt the life draining from her body, her strength fading with each blow. The crowd around froze in shock. No one dared to intervene. Everyone who watched this terrible spectacle felt the cold fear penetrate their bones. Their hearts pounded wildly, and some of the spectators, unable to bear it, began to cry. But everyone knew that if anyone rushed forward, they would become the next victim. The policeman was like a beast that had lost its mind. Mrs. Jenkins tried to speak, but instead of words, only a hoarse sound came out of her throat. She wanted to call her son. She wanted to see him at least in her last moments, but her voice was too weak. She could no longer move. Her hands were shaking, and she could barely breathe. The only thing she felt was the horror of the imminent death that was so close. The policeman leaned over her, his face twisted in cruelty. He grabbed her hair, roughly forcing her head up to look him in the eye. "That's it. That's how you should all look. Under my feet," he said through gritted teeth, his hands still clutching her hair, pulling it so hard that the skin on her scalp burned with pain. Mrs. Jenkins could no longer resist. Her body did not obey, and she felt the coldness gradually creeping up to her heart. Her breathing became quieter and quieter, and shadows began to flicker before her eyes. She was on the edge, between life and death. The policeman kicked her hard in the side again, and her body rolled senseless on the ground. Her fingers trembled, and blood continued to flow from her broken lips. The crowd could no longer watch, but no one could move. People stood paralyzed with fear, not believing what was happening before them. And suddenly, as if through the thickness of pain and horror, Mrs. Jenkins felt someone's presence nearby. Her swollen eyes could barely make out the figure of James, her son, who was desperately trying to break through to her through the policeman. James lunged forward, his heart pounding in his chest as if it might burst. He watched as the cop destroyed not only his mother with every blow, but everything she represented: her strength, her resilience, her love. A wave of anger rose inside him, filling him like he was about to explode. He screamed, throwing himself at the cop, trying to distract him, to save his mother, but the hatred that emanated from the man was like poison, seeping into his soul. "Leave her alone," James growled when he finally reached the policeman. He grabbed him by the shoulder, but the policeman turned around with fury, his eyes blazing like a wild animal. "Get out, brat," he shouted, pushing James away. James, not expecting such strength, stumbled back, but did not give in. He knew he could not let this man kill his mother. At that moment, the policeman, wiping blood from his lips, raised his baton again. He was ready to destroy everything that was thrown at his feet once and for all, and in his gaze James saw a madness that could no longer be contained. "You think you can stop me?" the policeman sneered. "I'll do the same to you as I did to her." He rushed towards James, but James, gathering all his strength, managed to dodge. The club flew past, hitting the ground with a dull sound, but James knew that time was running out. Every moment was precious, and his mother was suffering on the ground, her life hanging by a thread. James lunged forward again, and this time he was able to grab the cop by the wrist, preventing him from raising his baton again. He could feel the cop's hatred trying to tear him apart, but he wasn't going to give in. He knew this was not just a fight for his mother's life, but for the future, for the chance for people like his mother to live in a world where they weren't bullied or persecuted. "You can't do this," he shouted, trying to shake the policeman, realizing that he simply didn't understand what he had done. But the policeman let out an animal roar of rage, and James felt his strength begin to weaken. Mrs. Jenkins, lying on the ground, heard the sounds of the struggle and felt her heart breaking with fear for her son. She knew that this policeman was ruthless, and his every move was full of malice. But despite her horror, she could not help but be proud of James, who tried to protect her even when her own strength was failing. "James, don't," she whispered, barely audible, but her voice was too weak to be heard. Her fear for her son only added to the pain in her heart. The policeman, breaking free from James's grip, swung his baton again. The blow was swift, and James only managed to retreat for a moment, but the blow still landed on his shoulder. Pain shot through his body. He screamed, but the rage raging inside him made him rise again. "I won't let you kill her," James screamed. Despite everything he was feeling, he gathered his last strength and rushed at the policeman, realizing that the fight could only end in two cases: either they both win, or one of them dies. But at that moment, James felt his strength leaving him, fear taking over his entire being. The policeman was stronger, his anger was boundless, and his weapon was merciless. He knew that he could break him at any moment. However, James was not going to give up. He understood that his mother's life was at stake, and this thought gave him strength. He rushed into the attack again, trying to force the policeman to retreat. As if in response to his desperate efforts, a loud siren sounded. It was salvation, but the policeman was not going to wait for help. Like a madman, he raised his baton again, ready to strike. Even as the crowd's screams grew louder, James knew they had to act quickly, or it would be too late. "Mom, hold on," he screamed, desperately trying to distract the policeman as he swung again. But instead the officer came rushing towards him, and James felt fear squeeze his heart. The policeman charged at him again, but at that moment James noticed other people approaching them, apparently drawn by the sounds of the fight. They were running towards the scene, and on their faces was the same terrible realization of what was happening. James hoped that they could help, that together they could stop this insane act of violence. But the policeman, realizing that help was near, turned to the crowd and, biting his lip with hatred, barked, "Get out! It's none of your business. You're all like that. I'll kill you all if you don't leave." And in that moment, James realized that they had to act. He knew that he couldn't let his mother fall victim to this ruthless system that was willing to destroy everything in its path for the sake of its power and control. James, standing on the edge of a chasm of fear and rage, felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. He knew it was all up to him. Every moment they lost brought his mother closer to her inevitable end. Just as the cop closed his eyes, ready to strike again, James stepped forward. "Don't you dare touch her," he shouted, his voice full of determination. He lunged at the policeman, trying to distract him from Mrs. Jenkins, but the officer rebuffed his attempt with unexpected ferocity. The policeman, feeling threatened, turned and punched James in the chest. He fell to the ground, his lungs expelled from the blow, but he rose again, refusing to give in. At that moment, as the world around him began to blur and fear pressed on his chest, he looked at his mother lying on the ground and saw not only fear in her eyes, but also boundless love. It gave him strength. "James, I'm okay." Her quiet voice, full of pain but insistence, broke through his fragile consciousness, and he realized that she needed him. Her courage, even in these terrible moments, was a light in the darkness for him. "Mom, I won't leave you," he screamed, rushing toward the policeman again, his fists clenched into fists, and he felt all his suffering and fear merge into one single desire to protect his mother. He knew he had to fight. The policeman, feeling a new impulse, became even more aggressive. He swung his baton, and the moment James was level with him, the blow landed squarely on his shoulder, sending him flying back to the ground. Pain shot through him, as if hot metal had pierced his flesh. But in that moment, a spark ignited in James's heart. He remembered all those years his mother had spent raising him, fighting against injustice and prejudice. He remembered her kindness, her courage, and that became his motivation. "You can't break me," he growled, rising from the ground. The look of surprise in his police adversary's eyes only spurred James on. He rose to his feet, every muscle in his body filled with determination. But the policeman was not going to give up. Like a wild animal, he swung his baton again and struck with force. But at that moment a piercing sound of sirens filled the air like a bolt from the blue. The crowd, which had been watching this nightmare for a long time, began to show activity. People, realizing that what was happening could no longer remain unpunished, began to move forward. "Get away from her," one man in the crowd shouted, pushing forward. It was like an awakening. Someone in the crowd realized that their silence could cost them their lives. The cry became a signal, and people began to unite. The policeman, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to retreat, but this only fueled more anger and determination in the hearts of those watching. They could no longer stand by and watch this man continue to abuse a woman who could have been the mother of any of them. James, taking advantage of the officer's confusion, rushed forward, through the crowd, to approach his mother again. He saw her eyes go dull, her breathing become more and more ragged. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't let this officer win. "Mom, I'm with you," he cried, falling down next to her. He hugged her, trying to support her as his heart fluttered with fear. But at that moment, the policeman, feeling threatened, swung his baton again. Someone in the crowd shouted, "This is wrong. We will not allow this to continue." Hands grabbed the policeman, pulling him back. People began to unite, and suddenly the moment turned to stone as hatred met courage. The policeman, realizing he was no longer in control, tried to run, but now he was surrounded. "You are all under arrest," he roared, his voice rising to a scream as he saw his power shattered. But none of the assembled men were about to give in. They were determined to stop this act of cruelty. Their anger united, their passion for justice relentless. James, still holding on to his mother, looked at the people around him, and at that moment his heart was filled with hope. They had come to help, and he knew that together they could stop this madness. Every person in the crowd was determined, and at that moment their faces reflected not only their hatred for the policeman, but also their willingness to protect each other, their willingness to fight for life and dignity. James felt his heart pounding in his chest as he hugged his mother, her body exhausted and torn. He could hear people gathering around them, ready to support them, but it all seemed distant and insignificant compared to the violence happening right in front of him. The policeman, spitting threats, was trying to regain control. His aggression was growing by the minute, and he began to swing his baton again, ready to deliver another crushing blow. "Get your hands off her," one of the men shouted, trying to pull the policeman away from Mrs. Jenkins, but the policeman refused to let go of his victim. His eyes flashed with anger and fury, as if he were a hunter who had found his prey. "Don't interfere unless you want the same thing to happen to you," he barked, and it was like a knife to the heart. James's eyes blazed with rage as he watched the policeman become more and more despotic with each passing moment, a state that caused nothing but helpless despair in those around him. Despite the efforts of the crowd, the policeman swung at Mrs. Jenkins again and again, and every blow, every cruel cry, seemed to awaken in them more fear and despair. "Please stop," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice full of pain. She couldn't hold back the tears, and they ran down her cheeks, mixing with the blood. She knew that her strength was fading, and she couldn't allow herself to think about what might happen. There was not only pain in her eyes, but also fear for her son. She didn't want James to become a victim of the same hatred that haunted her. But the policeman was not going to stop. Each blow was filled with hatred, and his face was distorted with rage. He hit her again and again, not noticing how bloody traces left imprints on the asphalt. He watched with pleasure as her body shook from pain, as her eyes lost their shine, and this only spurred on his aggression. "You think you're important?" he hissed, as if hatred for her existence filled him. "You mean nothing. None of you mean anything." James, on the edge of madness, prepared for a desperate step. He knew that if he did nothing, his mother would die. He took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts, but his anger, malice and helplessness mixed into one unbearable cocktail of emotions. "I won't let you take her," he screamed, rushing towards the policeman again. At that moment he realized that he was now the target, and it was like a knife in the heart, but he couldn't give up. The cop turned to him, his eyes full of hatred. The next moment he threw his baton at James, who dodged it. Feeling the adrenaline rush through him, he lunged forward, and this time his hands found a hold. He grabbed the cop by the shoulder and pulled him back. But the policeman turned like a ferocious beast, and James felt his strength fading. He knew that this fight could only be won by united efforts, and when he turned to see his mother, his heart sank with horror. She lay unconscious, her body covered in bruises, and blood trickled from her broken lips. "No, Mom!" he screamed, and his scream was full of pain, hopelessness and fear. He couldn't let this be the end. The people around, seeing the situation escalate, began to act. They pooled their efforts, and although the policeman was aggressive and ruthless, the numbers were on their side. They began to shout, demanding justice, demanding that the policeman stop his brutality. "This is not okay," someone from the crowd shouted. "We're here to stop it." But the policeman only smirked. Seeing his power begin to crumble, he took a step back, but his hatred knew no bounds. He knew his fear and control of the situation were slipping away, and this only fueled his anger. "You will all answer for this," he shouted, and his voice sounded as if he was losing his mind. But James knew this was their chance. He rose from the ground, his body battered but his resolve intact. He rushed forward as people began to surround the policeman, trying to pull Mrs. Jenkins from his grasp. But before they could do anything, the policeman, as the last defender of his despotism, pulled out his gun. At that moment, the air around them froze. Everyone froze, realizing that the situation had reached its extreme point. "Get out or I'll shoot you all," he shouted, his voice shaking with tension. There was a fire in his eyes, and it was the most terrifying moment, when everyone present realized that everything could end in an instant. James felt panic rising in his heart. He understood that now not only his life, but also the lives of the people around him were in danger. And when his mother, full of pain and fear, turned her last glances on him, he understood that now everything depended on him. "We won't let you do this," he shouted, his voice full of determination. He knew he couldn't just stand by and watch them be destroyed. But the policeman only grinned, his fingers trembling on the trigger of his gun. There was nothing human in his eyes anymore, only wild hatred and a desire to destroy everything he did not understand. "It's your mistake," he whispered, and at that moment time seemed to stop. People around him began to move, but fear paralyzed them. James's heart was filled with unbearable anxiety. He knew this could be his last chance to save his mother and his life. And as the crowd began to close in, the policeman raised his hand, ready to pull the trigger, a muffled shot that could change everything in an instant. The seconds dragged on, and there was a tense silence in the air as the policeman clutched his gun, preparing to fire. James could feel his heart pounding, as if each beat was echoing in his ears, creating an unbearable symphony of fear and despair. He looked at his mother lying on the ground, her eyes closed, her face mangled, and in that moment, his resolve only grew stronger. "Mom, I'm with you," he screamed, preparing for the last desperate step. He couldn't let this policeman be the one to take her life. He knew he only had one chance, and he couldn't waste it. The crowd, terrified but determined, began to move. Their voices fused into one powerful cry, demanding justice and protection. It was like a jolt that woke James from his helplessness, and he felt the fire of anger blazing inside him. "We are not afraid of you," someone from the crowd shouted, and this cry became a signal for the others. People began to rise, their determination flowed into action, and they began to move forward as a single unit. The policeman, aware that his control of the situation was slipping, began to tremble. His gaze darted between James and the crowd, panic shining in his eyes. He knew that his actions could lead to a real uprising, and this frightened him. "Take your hands off me, I'll shoot you all," he shouted again, but now his voice was less confident. Inside him, he felt his power waning. He had become a despot, surrounded by those who would no longer tolerate his cruelty. At that moment, James, unaware of his fear, stood up to his full width. He knew he had only a moment to change the course of events. "I won't let you kill her," he shouted, breaking through the crowd, and in that moment he felt his determination overwhelm him. He raised his hands, trying to get the policeman's attention. "Listen to me," his voice was firm. "This is not just my mother. This is a woman who deserves to live. We are all here for justice." The crowd began to rise, supporting his shout, and James saw some of them ready to act, leaving the policeman no chance. They were forming a protective barrier around Mrs. Jenkins, their hands clenched into tight fists, and they were looking at the policeman as if he were an enemy. The policeman, losing his patience, raised his gun. James saw his finger begin to squeeze the trigger, and in that moment everything changed. Every breath seemed like his last, every movement unbearable. In that moment, the crowd made a decision. They couldn't let this happen. "Behind you," someone shouted, and people started moving. Hundreds of eyes were looking at the policeman, and they were no longer afraid. They were ready to act to stop this madness. At that moment, there was a sharp sound. Someone from the crowd threw a bottle at the policeman. It was like a spark in a powder keg. The policeman, frightened, took a step back, and his weapon moved, as if the world around him had gone crazy. "Get him out," one of the men shouted, and at that moment James saw several people rushing towards the policeman. It was like a storm breaking out in their hearts. James, not knowing how much longer he could hold back, lunged forward, grabbing the policeman's hand where he held the gun. It was a desperate move, and James felt his body fill with pain, but he couldn't give in. "You won't get it," he growled, ignoring the pain. At this point, the policeman, overcome with rage, tried to free his hand, but James was not going to let him go. The world began to spin around them. The people gathered in the crowd began to act as one, drawing the policeman's attention away from Mrs. Jenkins. They began to shout for justice, and in that moment James felt the power of that unity overwhelm him. But the cop was furious. He screamed, threw James aside, and pointed his gun at the growing crowd. He knew his time was running out, and he had to make a choice. That choice was not just a matter of control, but a matter of life and death. James fell to the ground as the rest of the crowd rushed towards the policeman. It was like a battle that could have ended in tragedy, and James saw a real battle for life and dignity unfolding around him. At that moment, a shot rang out. Time stood still as everyone froze, each holding their breath, not believing that this was happening. The seconds dragged on, and as the sounds of chaos gradually died down, James, getting up from the ground, realized that everything had changed. He looked at his mother, and in her eyes, filled with fear and pain, he saw something else, determination and hope. But now everything depended on whether they could unite against this horror and defeat the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. James felt a cold sweat run down his back as he realized his mother was unconscious and the policeman was still threatening the crowd. His fear and anger mixed together, creating a whirlwind of emotions that drove him forward. He couldn't let this despot take away his only family, his only source of love and support. A determination was born inside him. He stood up from the ground, shocked and filled with hatred at what was happening before his eyes. With each step towards the policeman, he felt his fear fading, replaced by courage. He knew he had to intervene to stop this injustice. "You have no right to treat her like that," he shouted, his voice strong and confident despite the fear that was burning in his heart. James moved closer, trying to position himself between the policeman and his mother, like a shield. The policeman, momentarily distracted from the crowd, turned to James, his eyes blazing with hatred, and he gripped his baton so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Get out of my way, boy," he said menacingly, as if he were about to attack. "You don't know who you're dealing with." James swallowed, but did not back down. He knew that his actions could be decisive. He gathered all his courage and continued, "This is my mom. She didn't do anything to deserve this treatment. We were just sitting in the park enjoying the day." With each word he spoke, the tension in the air grew. The crowd around them, feeling James's encouragement and courage, began to rise, their voices merging into one cry. They demanded justice, demanded that the policeman stop. "You have no right to be so cruel," one woman from the crowd shouted, her voice resolute. The policeman, realizing that his control was slipping, took another swing at James, his eyes blazing with madness, and he seemed willing to do anything to maintain his dominance. James stepped forward to protect his mother. He didn't want anyone else to get hurt. He knew this situation was more than just a personal tragedy. He rushed towards the officer, feeling his body fill with adrenaline, and at the last moment, he tried to grab the officer's hand that held the gun. It all happened quickly. The cop spun around, and James felt his hand touch cold metal. But at that moment, Another scream rang out as several people in the crowd began throwing things at the cop, trying to distract him. "Don't touch him, you bastard," one of the men shouted, throwing the bottle. The policeman, distracted, took a step back, giving James the opportunity to grab him by the shoulder. "I won't let you hurt her," James shouted, his voice filled with rage. He felt the support of those around him, and it gave him strength. The crowd began to move, forming a shield around Mrs. Jenkins. People linked their hands, creating a protective circle that the police officer could not enter. It was like a powerful expression of unity and strength that they had never experienced before. The policeman, seeing that he was surrounded, became even more aggressive. He raised his baton and began threatening the crowd again, but this only strengthened the determination of those around him. "We will not retreat," one of the men shouted, raising his fist. People began to shout, creating a powerful chorus of opposition. It was like a wave that washed over the policeman, and he felt fear wash over him. James used this moment to move closer to his mother. He leaned over her, his heart aching as he saw her wounded face. He pulled her close, trying to give her his strength and support. "Mom, I'm with you," he whispered, holding her close. He knew she was in a difficult situation, but his love for her filled him with strength. He felt her breathing getting weaker, and it spurred him on. "James," she whispered, opening her eyes. There was tenderness in her gaze as well as pain. "Don't risk your life. I don't want you to get hurt." "I can't just watch," he replied, squeezing her hand. "I won't let him take you." As the crowd continued to advance on the policeman, his panic grew. He realized that his only power was fear, and as fear began to leave the people, his own power was disintegrating. James finally gathered his strength. He knew he had to act decisively, and in that moment, as the crowd rose, he stood up again, ready to fight for his mother. He looked at the policeman, determined to stop this cruelty. "We won't let you leave with her," he shouted, and it was a challenge that couldn't be ignored. The people around him echoed his cry, and he felt a wave of unity wash over them. This was no longer just one man's fight. It was a fight for justice, for life, for freedom, and while there was still fear, it became less significant as everyone in the crowd realized they were not alone. James, full of strength, turned back to the policeman. He knew that their unity was what could change the situation. He was ready to do everything to protect his mother and everyone who stood next to him. James stood rooted to the spot in front of the policeman, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. His eyes were filled with rage, mixed with horror that his mother had suffered because of this man who was supposed to protect, not oppress. Every second he waited felt like an eternity, and he knew he couldn't let this go on. Gathering his strength, he saw the crowd supporting him like a powerful wave, ready to sweep away everything in its path. It gave him courage, and he took a deep breath and stepped forward. His mind was filled with determination. He knew that he had to protect his mother and stop this horror. "You will get nothing from me," he shouted, raising his voice so that everyone around could hear. "Don't touch her." The policeman, clearly taken aback by James's audacity, clutched his baton in his hand and hesitated for a moment. He had never expected anyone to dare stand up to him, but that only made him angrier. "You're too small to make a difference," he growled, trying to intimidate James. But James, feeling the crowd's support, rose to his feet as if the whole world had become his ally. "You can't intimidate us," James shouted. His voice was so loud that he surprised himself. He took another step toward the policeman, and his eyes lit up. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted to us, but we won't keep quiet." A cheer began to rise from the crowd. People, inspired by James's courage, began to rise, creating a united front against cruelty. It was like a magnetic field, and everyone felt that this was the moment of truth. The policeman, realizing that his power was beginning to fade, tried to use force. He raised his baton and took a step toward James. At that moment, a thought flashed through James's mind. He couldn't just stand by and watch his mother suffer. He gathered all his courage and rushed forward. "No!" he screamed, rushing at the policeman. He saw the baton coming and dodged at the last moment, trying to grab the policeman's arm. His actions were full of determination, and he knew that every moment mattered. James grabbed the officer's hand, his heart pounding. He pulled hard, trying to knock the baton out of his hands. The officer, not expecting such resistance, began to turn, trying to throw James off, but James was not going to let go. "Get your hands off my mother," James screamed, tightening his fingers around the policeman's wrist. He knew it was his only chance. The crowd around them cheered, and it gave him strength. The crowd, inspired by James's courage, began to move forward. People began to approach, uniting, creating a barrier between the policeman and Mrs. Jenkins. It was like a real storm, and the policeman's fear became more and more obvious. "Take your hands off," the policeman said menacingly, but his voice was no longer confident. He knew that his actions could lead to a real uprising, and this scared him. He tried to free his hand, but James held on tightly, not letting him go. At that moment, he felt the adrenaline rushing through his body and he focused on his goal. He knew that he had to do everything he could to protect his mother and avenge her suffering. James's gaze became more determined and he gathered all his strength and pushed the policeman hard, causing him to lose his balance. "You can't break us," he shouted, feeling his anger become all-encompassing. The people around him were cheering him on, and that gave him confidence. They began to raise their hands, creating a united front against the policeman who couldn't understand what was happening. The policeman, losing control, made another attempt to get rid of James. He swung his baton, but the crowd began to act. People rushed forward, distracting him and causing real panic in his eyes. It was a powerful reaction, and James felt the forces on his side. The crowd became increasingly aggressive and they began throwing things at the police officer, creating chaos. James saw his supporters standing behind him and it filled him with confidence. He knew that together they could win and he should not back down. James lunged at the policeman again, grabbing his shoulder and pushing him away. It was like two worlds colliding. On one side, his mother's fragile life, and on the other, the cruelty they could no longer tolerate. He felt like this was the moment they could change everything. "You can't just leave," he shouted as the crowd gathered around him, giving him even more strength. The policeman, realizing that he would not have any support, tried to hit James again, but James dodged and grabbed him again. At that moment, the sound of sirens was heard. The police cars were approaching, and fear gripped the crowd again. James knew that time was running out. He knew he had to act quickly. "We have to get her away," he shouted, pointing at his mother. "She needs help." With that, he turned back to the policeman, but now he was ready to fight. He wasn't going to give up until he had his mother safe. The crowd around him wasn't going to give up either. They sprang into action, moving toward Mrs. Jenkins to lift her up and carry her away for protection. James clasped his hands tightly, feeling his heartbeat beat in unison with the hearts of those around him. This was more than just a fight for his mother. It was a fight for all their lives, for the right to be heard, and for justice. And at that moment, when everything seemed hopeless, he noticed several people from the crowd rushing towards him, ready to support him. It was a real unity, and they all understood that they were not alone. James, inspired by this, shouted, "Let's do it together." At his call, the crowd rose again, their cries rising with renewed vigor. It was a true act of solidarity, and in that moment, James realized that they could make a difference if they acted as one. "We will fight for our truth," he shouted, clenching his fists and raising them up. It was a moment of strength that no policeman could break. And then, filled with determination, they began to act to bring back the justice that was being taken from them. James felt the energy of the crowd fill him, giving him strength. Every cry, every movement, every united breath became a single whole, capable of standing up to injustice. Grabbing his mother's arm, he helped her up, feeling her grip on his shoulder tightly. There was fear in her eyes, but also pride in her son, who was not going to back down. "We're leaving, Mom," he whispered, trying to calm her down as the crowd began to move toward the park's exit. The policeman, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, began to panic. He shouted into his radio, but James knew they only had a few minutes to get out. The crowd, united by a common purpose, began to close in on James and his mother. People pushed forward, forming a human wall between them and the police officer, who was desperately trying to regain control of the situation. His threat became empty. and as he watched the world crumble around him, he swung his baton at one of the crowd members. But at that moment, someone standing next to James managed to push the policeman away, creating an opening for him. It was like a spontaneous movement, like-minded people coming together to stop the violence. James felt his own heart fill with hope and strength as the crowd began to move toward the exit, and they became a single force that could stop the violence. "Stay together," someone from the crowd shouted, and this call to action became a signal for everyone. Each of them understood that now was the moment when they had to be united to keep each other safe. James, holding his mother's hand tightly, felt her weakness, but at the same time he felt her support, as if she gave him strength. They slowly started moving towards the exit, but the policeman, enraged, shouted at them to stop. He knew that if the crowd left, his authority would be undermined and he would no longer be able to regain control of the situation. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice menacing and threatening, but no one was going to give in to fear now. People in the crowd, inspired by James's courage, began to shout their demands for justice. "We will not remain silent," came from the crowd. "Enough violence." With every step, with every cry, their determination only grew. James felt his anger transform into strength, and he was not going to let this policeman lay a hand on his mother again. He strode forward, his eyes full of determination. The crowd continued to move towards the exit, but at that moment James saw a police officer swing his baton, trying to attack them again. It was like slow motion, and he knew he had to act fast. "Look out!" he shouted, and the crowd, feeling threatened, began to part to avoid the blow. But this gave James the opportunity to get closer to the policeman, and he gathered all his strength. "You can't intimidate us," he shouted, and at that moment, as if under the influence of force, he rushed forward, trying to knock the baton out of the policeman's hands. It was risky, but James knew that he had to protect his mother and the others. He felt rage flare up inside him as he grabbed his baton. He wasn't going to let this cop get away with it. But at that moment, one of the backup cops saw what was happening and lunged at James, trying to stop him. This was the beginning of the real fight. The crowd screamed as the police began to act, but James was not going to back down. He was determined to protect his mother and everyone who stood by him. Every blow from the police was like a blow to justice, and he felt he had to stand to the end. "We won't let you do this," he shouted, turning to the crowd. "For me, for us." The crowd, gripped by a single spirit, began to rise again. People began to push towards the police, who began to retreat under the onslaught. James felt his body fill with adrenaline, and he was not going to give in. He threw his baton to the ground and raised his hands, calling everyone around him to action. "Together we are stronger," he shouted, and his words echoed in the hearts of the people. They began to act together as one, and it was like a powerful movement that could not be stopped. The police, realizing they were losing control, began looking around in confusion, but the crowd, inspired by James, was not going to retreat. They continued to advance, creating a barrier that did not allow the police to advance any further. "Get out of our way!" one of the men shouted, and it became an order that everyone understood. The crowd began to tighten, creating a powerful line, and James felt his confidence grow. Finally, the crowd broke free, and James turned to his mother. He saw her weak face, and it was like a blow to the heart. He knew their fight was not over, but now they were free from the threat of the policeman. "We did it, Mom," he said, holding her and feeling her breathing become more even. He knew they had survived, and now they had a chance to escape the violence. Laughter and cheers filled the air as the crowd realized they had succeeded, but inside James, a spark of rage and determination continued to burn. He knew this was just the beginning. They had to keep fighting for their rights, for their family, and for all those who had faced injustice. "We will fight on," he shouted, and the crowd responded to his words again. It was a promise they made to each other. They were united, and this unity became their strength. Now that they were free of the threat, James knew they had to come together to change the world around them. This battle was not just for his mother, but for the future of all those who had suffered injustice. It was a fight that was just beginning. James felt the adrenaline still pumping through his veins as they left the park. He held his mother's hand, her face pale with fear and pain. but her eyes still lit with hope. They were gone, but his heart was already burning with the desire for revenge. He knew he couldn't just let this go. Having collected his thoughts, he began to plan how to avenge his mother and all those who had faced cruelty. Every night, looking at the ceiling, he returned to the moment when the policeman raised his hand to his mother. This image did not leave him, turning into a strong desire for justice. He understood that he could not cope alone, and decided to turn to his friends. At school, he gathered his peers, telling them what had happened in the park. Each of them felt the same rage and helplessness, and it brought them together. They began to discuss how to confront the police, who they believed acted with impunity. "We have to show them we're not afraid," said one of the friends, Derek, his voice confident. "If we work together, we have a chance to change this." James agreed. At that moment, they decided to create a group that would monitor police actions and record any cases of injustice. It was not just revenge, but a way to fight for their rights and the rights of others. A few days later, they learned that the same police officer who had attacked his mother was patrolling the same area again. It was time to put their plan into action. James and his friends decided to stage a protest to draw attention to what had happened to his mother. They began organizing a group, making posters and preparing slogans. James knew it would be risky, but he couldn't stand by. "We must show that we are not alone," he said, looking at his friends. "That will be our message to everyone." On the day of the protest, as the sun began to set, they gathered a crowd of people. James stood at the forefront, his heart pounding with excitement. The crowd began to gather, and they were joined by others who had similar experiences. "We're here to say, no more violence," he shouted into the microphone, his voice loud and confident. This was his moment, and he could feel the crowd responding to his words. The protest began with peaceful cries, but with each passing minute the tension grew. People stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding justice and the right to be heard. James felt that this was more than just revenge for his mother. It was a fight for all those who had ever suffered at the hands of those who were supposed to protect. As the protest reached its peak, James noticed police cars starting to arrive. As he watched them, he felt a desire for justice flare up within him. He knew this could be dangerous, but he wasn't going to back down. "We are not afraid of you," he shouted, and the crowd responded with one voice. The police officers stepped out of their cars, their faces serious, but James sensed that it was only a mask. Inside, they could feel the fear, too. They knew that their power was being tested at this moment. James knew he had to do something drastic to avenge his mother and show that they would not tolerate injustice. With his friends gathered, they began to move towards the police. It was like the fear and anger was back, but now they were not alone. "We know what you did," James shouted, pointing at the police officers. "We're here to let you know that we won't let you treat us like this again." The crowd was cheering him on, and James could feel the power of unity filling them. The police, noticing this, began to exchange glances, and he realized that fear was already beginning to take hold of them. This was their moment, and they weren't going to waste it. However, at this time the police began to use force. They tried to disperse the crowd, but James, having gathered all his strength, stepped forward again. "We're not leaving," he shouted, his voice firm. At that moment, he looked into the eyes of one of the policemen, and saw only fear and confusion there. That was exactly what he was looking for. Pulling himself together, James rushed forward and grabbed one of the officers by the arm. As he had done earlier, his friends supported him, and soon a circle formed around him, creating a single barrier between the police and the protesters. It was like magic. They felt that together they could achieve justice. The crowd began to scream and move forward, and the police realized they were losing control. At that moment, James, standing at the forefront, raised his hand with a sign that read, "We have a right to justice." It was his manifesto, his challenge. "We will not remain silent," he shouted, and at that moment the police began to retreat. It was like a sudden realization that they could no longer control the situation. James saw fear fill the police officers' faces. They were only human, and in that moment he realized that they, too, had their weaknesses. They, too, were afraid. This revelation filled him with strength, and he, inspired, continued to move forward. "We will win," he said as the crowd responded with cries of encouragement. Everyone in that moment felt like they could change the world. This wasn't just avenging his mother, it was fighting for everyone who had ever suffered. And in that moment, James realized that they could actually win. Their united movement became a powerful symbol of hope, and even the police began to retreat. This was his revenge, not in a physical sense, but in showing that together they could achieve justice and change the world for the better. He didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment he felt that the fight was just beginning. As James felt the police begin to retreat, satisfaction welled up in him. He realized that their combined efforts had not been in vain. They had forced the aggressors to give in, and this moment became a symbol of victory for him. But rather than celebrate, James knew that the revenge he wanted was still not complete. The image of the police officer who had laid hands on his mother still swirled in his mind. An unquenchable thirst for justice burned within him, and he knew that he now needed to focus not only on protests, but on taking concrete action against those who had personified this injustice. "We can't just let this go," he said to his friends, who were still standing nearby. Overcome with a sense of unity, "We have to make this policeman answer for his actions." His friends' support gave him confidence, and he came up with an idea that began to gain momentum. They decided to gather all the evidence they could to prepare a report on the officer's actions. James knew that an important step would be to attract the attention of local media and human rights activists. Over the next few days, James and his friends began gathering information. They spoke to other witnesses to the incident, recorded their statements, and collected videos that had been taken during the protests. Each new piece of evidence added fuel to their resolve. They worked through the night, exchanging messages, discussing how best to approach the case. This was more than just revenge, it was a quest for justice. One evening, while James was hanging out with friends at the library, he suddenly received a text from one of them. A photo of a police officer standing with other officers on patrol appeared on his phone screen. James's eyes briefly fell on his face. It was the same officer who had attacked his mother. "We have to do something about this," he said, feeling anger boiling inside him. "We can't let him continue his service." His friends supported him, and they decided to organize an action. It was to be more than just a protest. They planned to call the press and make sure the whole country knew about what had happened in the park. James knew it would be risky, but their anger and determination outweighed their fears. On the day of the protests, they gathered a crowd outside the police station, ready to send a loud signal that they would not be silent. James stood at the forefront, holding a sign that read, "Justice for all." There was a fire in his eyes. He knew this was his moment, and he was not going to waste it. As local media began covering the event, James spoke into the microphone. He described how his mother had been attacked, the impact it had had on their family, and how they would fight to ensure something like this never happened again. "We are here to show that we will not remain silent," he shouted, his voice confident. The crowd supported him, and this gave him strength. But at that moment he noticed several police officers approaching them, their faces filled with displeasure. One of them, the same one who had attacked his mother, looked at him with disdain. "You don't belong here," he shouted, his voice threatening. But instead of fear, James felt a surge of determination. He stepped forward, looking the policeman in the eyes. "You must answer for your actions," he said, and the crowd shouted in support of his words. The patrol officers, seeing the crowd's reaction, began to lose confidence. James knew this was their chance. He continued to speak, his words laying bare all the pain and injustice they and others were facing. At this point, local media began recording what was happening, and more people gathered around. They held up their phones, recording what was happening, and soon it became a real wave of solidarity. However, the policeman, feeling that he was losing control, tried to attack James again, but this time, instead of fear, there was determination in his eyes. He was ready to protect not only his mother, but all those who faced such cruelty. James's friends rushed forward, forming a protective circle around him. It was a symbol of unity and struggle. They stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to defend their rights and the rights of others. "We are together, and we are stronger," one of the friends shouted, and this wave of support passed through the entire crowd. James felt they weren't alone, and that power inspired him. This wasn't just revenge, it was a fight for the future. Together, they could change the world and make sure that things like this never happened again. As it was happening, the policeman realized that the situation was getting out of control. He tried to call for backup, but it was too late. The crowd turned to him with demands for justice, and his disregard for people who stand up for their rights turned against him. James knew that their actions would make a difference. This was just the beginning of the fight, but now they were stronger than ever. Together, they were ready to fight for their rights and for the rights of everyone who faced injustice. Soon after, a wave of change began to take hold. Local human rights activists and the media began to take notice. James and his friends became a symbol of hope for many, and their stories spread across the country. But there was still a spark burning in James's heart. He knew that the revenge he wanted was not physical violence, but to let them know that they were not alone. Justice had to be served, and he was ready to fight for it to the end. That day, James and his friends did what seemed impossible. They stood in front of the police station, unafraid to speak out, their voices merging into one. Every shout, every word created a wave that swept through the surrounding area, reminding everyone that justice is not just a word, but a right for everyone. As the protest ended and the crowd began to disperse, James felt like they had truly accomplished something important. He looked at his friends, at the people gathered with them, and hope ignited in his heart. This wasn't just avenging his mother, but fighting for the rights of everyone who had ever suffered injustice. A few days later, as the media began covering their protests, attention to the incident increased. City officials were forced to respond to public pressure and began investigating the police officer who had assaulted his mother. This move was the first sign that change was possible. James met with other activists and human rights defenders who were willing to support their fight. They began organizing campaigns to raise awareness about police violence and making plans for the future to protect the rights of their community. With each passing day, James became increasingly aware that their efforts had not been in vain. Local residents began to take to the streets, expressing their support and demanding justice. James became a symbol of hope and strength, and his story inspired many to speak out about their experiences and fight for their rights. Although the road to justice was long, James knew they were not alone. Together, they continued to move forward, strengthening their ranks and fighting for a future where everyone could live without fear and inequality. And though his heart still held memories of that horrific day when his mother faced violence, James knew that the experience had become a catalyst for change. He no longer sought revenge, he sought justice, and therein lay true liberation. And so the story of James and his friends, filled with passion and determination, lived on. They weren't just fighting for their family, they were fighting for everyone who had ever suffered injustice. It was their mission to make the world a better place, and they were ready to fight for it until the end. And we hope you enjoyed this story and that it touched your hearts. We would love to hear your opinion. Write in the comments what you think about what is happening and whether you have experienced racism in your life. Your stories are very important to us, and we appreciate each of you. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us grow and create even more content. Thank you for being with us. Have a nice day.